30 years. Yeah, 3 whole decades of just pure fear hanging over Florida. 3 decades of this phantom, this specter, just haunting the sunny beaches and humid landscapes. Picture this, okay? It's the 1980s. You can almost feel the thick, sticky humidity in the air, right? You've got that smell of oranges mixing with the salty ocean breeze. But beneath all that postcard-perfect paradise, something seriously messed up was starting to grow. A real darkness seeping right into the ground of the Sunshine State. It all kicked off with a discovery. A body found just, swallowed up by some suffocating Florida swamp. Or maybe just left out on some lonely, empty road, miles from anyone who might see. These weren't just one-off bad things, you know. These were like little whispers, hints of a predator lurking in the shadows, leaving behind nothing but a pile of questions nobody could answer. The cops, they were completely stumped. The crime scenes were just brutal, made no sense at all. The victims seemed totally random. There wasn't any clear link, no pattern that even the most seasoned detectives could latch onto. It was like a nightmare playing out in slow motion, and you could just feel the terror building. Folks had no idea who was going to be next, or where the next horrifying discovery would pop up. At first, the media kinda treated them like individual heartbreaks, just separate acts of violence. But then, as more and more bodies started showing up, this really chilling realization started to creep in. This wasn't just one killer. It was a series, a serial killer, a ghost, a phantom creeping around Florida for 3 decades. So I'm your host. I've spent a crazy amount of time digging through the absolute darkest corners of true crime stories, trying to put together the pieces that the news just kinda missed. And the story of Florida's hidden killer, it's one of those tales that just doesn't fit into any neat little box. It's definitely a testament to how messed up humans can be, sure, but it's also this wild, almost unbelievable account of science getting a massive upgrade and a relentless chase for justice. Over the next, 28 minutes, you're gonna see how a bunch of really brutal murders, happening across different generations, finally got solved. You'll witness how a killer who seemed totally untouchable, a phantom who dodged capture for 30 years, was eventually unmasked by the most silent, undeniable witness there is, DNA. You'll learn about the huge leaps in technology that made it all possible, and about the people who just refused to give up, who wouldn't let these victims be forgotten. Those early days of the investigation, they were just packed with this gnawing frustration. Detectives were literally chasing shadows. The evidence, when there even was any, was often ruined by time and the weather. The technology just wasn't there yet to connect the dots that were scattered everywhere, across years and all over the state. Think about what forensic science was like back in the 1980s. DNA analysis was basically just a baby. It was brand new, super expensive, and definitely not something they used in regular investigations yet. For law enforcement, the challenge was just enormous. They were going up against a phantom killer with hardly any tools, and the clock was just ticking away. Every year that passed meant more potential evidence getting destroyed, more witnesses moving on, and the killer just getting bolder. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or FDLE, they were really on the front lines trying to make sense of this whole mess. They knew how serious it was, the real fear that was gripping all the communities. Their own publications would later talk a lot about how they solved cold cases, often pointing out how crucial DNA analysis became once it got more accessible and, actually worked well. Source: Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The legal roadblocks for prosecuting cases that had gone cold for so long were also pretty major. As a Florida Bar Journal article would later point out, cold case homicides come with their own special set of problems. Trying to dig up evidence that will hold up in court after all these decades, finding people who might have moved, and just dealing with the sheer passage of time, it all makes the legal side of things way harder. They desperately needed new ways to investigate and new legal strategies. Source: the Florida Bar Journal. If you looked back at the old newspapers from that time, like the Orlando Sentinel or the Miami Herald, they'd be full of stories about these unsettling crimes, the growing panic in the public, and the really frustrated comments you'd often hear from law enforcement officials. Those old articles are gold, really, capturing that raw fear and the desperate search for answers. Source: archival news articles. The killer, whoever this person was just like a ghost. They left barely any trace, or what little they did leave was too messed up to be useful with the tech they had back then. They moved through Florida like a whisper, striking and then just vanishing, leaving behind only the echoes of violence and this constant, gnawing fear of the unknown. Try to picture this scene. A detective, totally worn out, hunched over a tiny pile of physical evidence. The air in the police station is thick with stale coffee and just desperation. He's looking at smudged fingerprints that lead nowhere, witness descriptions that are all vague and totally contradict each other. He knows there's a monster out there, but he can't see him. He can't even give him a name. The weight of all these unsolved cases was just crushing. Not only for the families of the victims, who were stuck in this endless cycle of grief and not knowing, but for the police officers themselves. They carried the burden of these cold cases, the faces of the victims burned into their memories, a constant, painful reminder that they hadn't delivered justice yet. The late 80s and early 90s were a big shift for forensic science. While DNA fingerprinting was starting to show up, it wasn't the everywhere-you-look tool it is now. The whole process was complicated, needing a lot of really good quality DNA, which you often just didn't have from old, degraded crime scene samples. This report from the National Institute of Justice talks all about how forensic DNA analysis got better and how it became super important for solving cold cases. It really hammers home how much of a game-changer DNA technology turned out to be, turning investigations around that had been stuck for years, even decades. Source: Government Report Academic Study. The idea that a serial killer could be out there, operating for so long without getting caught, was almost impossible to imagine. It was like something out of a horror movie, a constant threat that just didn't fit with how police usually worked. How could someone commit murder after murder over such a huge stretch of time and still be free? The sheer nerve of it was terrifying. Florida, with its massive coastline, its thick, tangled swamps, and its population that was always moving around, made for a really tough place for investigators. A killer could easily just blend in or slip away, leaving hardly a trace. All those sunny beaches and tourist traps masked this dark underbelly, a place where predators could just thrive. The early investigations were really held back by a lack of connection between different police departments, and of course, the limits of the technology. Evidence found in one county might not have been systematically checked against evidence from another, especially if the crimes didn't seem connected right away. This is where the whole idea of the hidden killer really takes hold. Not hidden by accident or just bad luck, but hidden by time, by the fact that the investigative tools back then just weren't good enough, and by this chilling ability to just keep avoiding capture. He was like a ghost, a specter, a nightmare woven right into the history of Florida. The frustration investigators must have felt was just immense. They knew, or at least suspected, that this dangerous person was out there, capable of incredible violence, but they just didn't have the tools to actually find out who it was. It was this constant, nagging feeling of defeat. The legal system, too, would eventually have to deal with how complicated cases like this are. Court records, once they finally came out, would show these incredibly complex legal fights, the appeals, the arguments about whether evidence was even allowed after so many years. Looking at those records gives you a real peek into the painstaking effort it took to finally bring a suspect who'd been hiding for so long to justice. Source: Court records, legal filings. The victims, their stories were like these silent anchors in the middle of this storm of not knowing. Each life cut short, each family left completely shattered. Their faces, their memories, those were the fuel for the investigators who just refused to quit. They were the reason the hunt for the phantom killer kept going, even when it felt like all hope was gone. The pattern, even though it wasn't obvious at first, was definitely there. A series of crimes that, looking back, painted this horrifying picture of a predator who had been operating in the shadows for an unbelievably long time. Where the crimes happened, the way they were carried out, the fact that there was no immediate link, all these were pieces of a puzzle that would take decades to put together. The terror wasn't just in the attacks themselves, but in the idea that this person was still out there. Walking around, living their life, probably, all while their victims' lives were permanently over. The fact that they faced no consequences was just staggering. It was like a total betrayal of the social contract, this terrifying breakdown of safety that left entire communities on edge. The early investigative efforts must have been this painstaking, often totally pointless, grind. Following leads that went nowhere, talking to witnesses who barely remembered anything, poring over evidence that just offered no real answers. The limitations of the technology meant that even if they did find a suspect, proving they were the one who did it could be impossible. The sheer audacity of operating for so long is a huge part of why this case is so gripping and, frankly, so terrifying. It speaks to a level of cleverness, a really careful way of avoiding detection, and maybe a deep psychological need that drove these violent acts over such an extended period. The story of Florida's hidden killer is really a story about hope that was put on hold. It's about the victims whose justice was delayed and the families who endured this unimaginable pain for years and years. It's about the slow, painful crawl of an investigation that stretched across decades, a testament to how much persistence it takes when the odds are stacked against you. The Phantom Killer. That name was born out of sheer desperation, out of the simple fact that law enforcement couldn't wrap their heads around the reality of a predator who seemed to exist outside the normal rules of time and consequences. He was basically the embodiment of every parent's worst nightmare, every community's deepest fear. But the story doesn't just end with fear and frustration. It's also a story about how things changed. A story about how science, which started out so basic, would eventually catch up to the darkness. It's a story about how the silent, undeniable language of DNA would become the ultimate weapon against a phantom. The stage was set. A killer, invisible for 30 years, lurking in the humid shadows of Florida. A community living under this dark cloud of fear. And this dawning realization that the key to unlocking this mystery, which had been going on for decades, might not just be in traditional detective work, but in the microscopic code of life itself. The big question was hanging in the air. Could science and just sheer human grit finally bring this ghost to justice? Could they finally give a voice back to the victims who had been silenced? The answer was going to be found in how forensic science evolved, and in the unwavering commitment of the people who refused to let this killer stay hidden. Chasing a phantom is a long, tough road. It really pushes the limits of how patient you can be, how strong your convictions are, and what human ingenuity can really do. For 3 whole decades, Florida had to live with this chilling reality of an unknown predator. But the story of how he was eventually caught is this powerful proof of how progress marches on, and how the pursuit of justice never really dies. The era of the Phantom Killer was definitely an era of fear, but it was also a time when the seeds of the solution were being planted, even if nobody knew it at the time. The very advancements that would eventually expose him were slowly, painstakingly being developed and made better. It was a race against time, a race against evidence degrading, and a race against the killer staying free. The sheer amount of time he operated completely undetected is what makes this case so compelling and honestly so scary. It points to a deep understanding of how to operate, how to blend in, and how to avoid the authorities. It's this chilling reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones we never see coming, or the ones who can just hide in plain sight for decades. The legacy of these unsolved crimes cast a really long shadow over Florida. It created this deep-seated anxiety, a constant awareness that hidden danger could be lurking anywhere. And it pushed people in law enforcement and the scientific world to find better ways to fight against these kinds of elusive threats. The first investigations, as hard as they tried, were like trying to grab smoke with a colander. The tools just weren't good enough, our understanding of criminal profiling wasn't as developed, and the sheer logistical nightmare of connecting different crimes spread out across a huge state was just immense. This isn't just a story about a killer, it's a story about how justice itself has evolved. It's about how we, as a society, learn to adapt, to come up with new ideas, and to overcome our limitations in trying to keep innocent people safe and punish those who do wrong. The decades-long fight against this phantom killer would ultimately become the proving ground for the very science that would finally bring him down. The sense of impunity that killer must have felt is almost impossible to grasp. To keep doing these acts over a 30-year period suggests a total disconnect from the consequences of his actions, and this chilling confidence that he could remain undetected. But that confidence, eventually, would be his downfall. The whole narrative of the hidden killer is really tied to the limitations of the past. It shows a time when the systems in place just weren't ready to handle a threat that was so prolonged and so hard to catch. But it also sets the scene for the eventual victory of new technologies and dedicated people. The real cost of these crimes was immeasurable, not just in the lives lost, but in the years of fear and not knowing that were forced upon families and entire communities. The Phantom Killer represented a failure of the system to protect people, a wound that just festered for decades. Just the sheer passage of time meant that memories started to fade, evidence got ruined, and the initial urgency of the investigations just kinda died down. Yet, for some people, the search for justice never really stopped. It became this cold, hard, patient game of waiting for the right moment, the right clue, the right scientific breakthrough. The landscape of Florida itself played a part. It was so vast, with all its different kinds of terrain, that it offered tons of places to hide. A killer could just disappear into the Everglades or melt away into the anonymity of a busy city, leaving investigators with this incredibly huge area to search. The frustration just got worse knowing that somewhere out there, a predator was probably living a normal life, completely unaffected by the crimes that had destroyed so many others. This weird mix of impunity and suffering is what fueled the relentless, often thankless work of the cold case units. The title itself, 3 Decades, How DNA Caught Florida's Hidden Killer, is like a promise. It's a promise of a mystery, a promise of a long and desperate hunt, and a promise of a scientific solution. It's the setup for a story that, while definitely rooted in darkness, ultimately talks about the power of human ingenuity and how justice eventually wins out. The mystery of the Phantom Killer wasn't just about who he was, but how he managed to stay a phantom for so long. It was a puzzle that just couldn't be solved with normal methods, a testament to a level of evasion that seemed almost unreal. But the truth, as it often does, was hiding in the details, just waiting for the right tools to bring it out. The stakes for public safety were incredibly high. Every unsolved murder, every killer who got away, chipped away at public trust and created this widespread feeling of being vulnerable. The pressure on law enforcement to find this hidden killer was immense, a burden that just got heavier every single year. This opening is really all about setting up the size of the problem. A predator operating for an unbelievably long time, slipping away through a combination of cleverness and the limitations of forensic science back then. It's about getting ready for the dramatic reveal of how those limitations were eventually overcome. Florida, back in the late 1980s. You think beaches, sunshine, right? A real paradise for a lot of folks. But man, underneath all that, something nasty was brewing. A killer totally under the radar was just starting this whole reign of terror that go on for ages. The first hints that something was really wrong started popping up in the late 80s. Central Florida was getting hit with a string of absolutely brutal sexual assaults and murders. The victims, all different ages and from different walks of life, had this one terrifying thing in common. They were found dead, their lives just snuffed out. The local cops, who were used to the usual crime ups and downs, suddenly found themselves dealing with something way different. These attacks were savage, and they happened all over the place, quiet neighborhoods, lonely roads. The sheer nerve and brutality just left the investigators scratching their heads, totally frustrated. They were chasing a ghost. One of the very first cases that eventually get tied to this guy happened way back in 1987. A young woman attacked and killed right in her own home. It was a horrific scene and there wasn't much evidence to go on. Detectives busted their butts, following every lead, talking to anyone who might know something, but the trail just went cold. Little did they know this was just the start. Then came 1988, another murder, another victim. The details were eerily the same. A pattern, though faint, was starting to show, but the puzzle pieces just weren't fitting together to point to one single suspect. The investigation teams were completely swamped, their resources stretched to the absolute limit. The fear started to ripple out, way beyond just the families of the victims. You could just feel the frustration in the air. These law enforcement officers, dedicated to keeping their towns safe, felt totally helpless. They were chasing phantoms, and their best efforts were leading nowhere. This killer was smart, leaving behind hardly any forensic clues that could be easily figured out with the tech back then. Now, remember, this was way before we had DNA everywhere or fancy computer forensics. Investigations were pretty much old school, witness accounts, fingerprint checks, and trying to match shoe prints. But this killer, he was careful. He was like a phantom, seeming to just slip right through the cracks of the justice system. Making things even crazier was the killer's own history. Years before, when he was just a kid, he'd pulled off this bold escape from a youth detention center. This wasn't just some casual walkout. It showed he was cunning and really didn't want to be caught. That escape let him disappear, basically start over, and set the stage for what he'd do later. The system, just starting to figure out how to handle this kind of really smart criminal, wasn't really set up for it. Because he escaped, his past was all murky, making it super tough to connect him to the crimes he was now committing. He was like a ghost with a history of vanishing. The early forensic evidence? Pretty basic stuff. Fingerprints, if they found them, were usually smudged or incomplete. Witness descriptions were vague, didn't always match up, and honestly, not always reliable. A shoe print here, a random fiber there, these were the tiny clues left behind, but they were too scattered, too common, to really paint a clear picture of who was doing this. Picture this. Detectives dusting for prints for hours only to find smudges. Collecting fibers, desperately hoping they were unique, only to realize they could have come from literally anywhere. The technology in the late 80s and early 90s, while pretty cool for its time, just wasn't advanced enough to definitively nail a suspect to these awful crimes with the certainty needed to actually prosecute. The legal side of things, dealing with these long-running, complicated serial cases, was also still finding its feet. Cold cases often just went cold, sometimes forever. This happened because there wasn't enough solid evidence or they just couldn't figure out who the suspect was. The justice system, dealing with limited resources and ever-changing forensic abilities, was really struggling to keep up. But even with all this tech and system struggle, a tiny thread started to show itself. Something common, almost like a signature, left behind at the scenes of the sexual assaults. The presence of semen or other bodily fluids started getting documented. At first, these findings were handled with the limited tools they had. Samples got collected, stored away, but their real potential was pretty much untapped. The technology needed to analyze these tiny biological traces and compare them effectively just wasn't really around yet. It was like having a key, but no idea what door it might unlock. These biological samples, though, were a super important piece of the puzzle, even if nobody realized it at the time. They were like silent witnesses, holding the killer's genetic code, just waiting for the day science would finally be able to catch up to his cruelty. The early 90s saw these crimes keep happening, and each one just made the fear and desperation grow. Police departments in different counties started swapping information, seeing the disturbing similarities. But without a suspect, without a clear link, the investigation stayed scattered and incomplete. The killer, meanwhile, just kept going, seeming almost bolder because he hadn't been caught. He was a master of disguise, not in how he looked, but in his total anonymity. He moved through society, a predator right there in front of everyone, while the system tried and failed to connect the dots. The limitations of that era are pretty striking. The Orlando Sentinel and the Miami Herald back then reported on individual cases, really highlighting how brave the victims were and how hard the detectives were working. But these reports often pointed out the lack of progress, the frustration of investigators who just couldn't catch the guy. Source: archival news articles. The legal hurdles were huge. Prosecuting a serial offender needs a really strong chain of evidence. Without a clear identification, without being able to absolutely link the suspect to multiple crime scenes, cases would just sit there, and victims would become just another name on a list of unsolved crimes. Source: Florida Legal Journal. The very nature of cold cases meant that evidence degraded over time, memories got fuzzy, and witnesses moved away or sadly passed on. The killer's audacious escape years before had basically reset his criminal clock, letting him start fresh, unburdened by his past in the eyes of the law back then. Source: court records. The early days of forensic science were like a weak candle in a really dark room. Investigators knew something crucial was there, a key piece of evidence, but they just didn't have the powerful spotlight of modern DNA analysis to really see it. The biological samples were collected, carefully kept, but their full potential wouldn't be unlocked for years. This whole period was marked by this really frustrating gap. You had a brutal serial offender running wild, and the system just couldn't catch him because of the limits in investigative tech and legal procedures. The stage was set for this desperate hunt that would take decades to finally wrap up. The presence of biological evidence, especially semen, was something that kept popping up in various reports about how these investigations were going. While it didn't lead to an arrest right away, it was the first real, tangible link between all the different crime scenes, even if it wasn't fully understood yet. Source: Government Report Academic Study. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, played a crucial role in tracking these patterns, even with the limitations they faced. They documented the growing number of similar cases, recognizing that a more coordinated effort was needed, even if the tools to make that coordination happen were still being developed. Source: Florida Department of Law Enforcement publication. The killer's ability to keep operating for so long, moving from one crime to the next, really showed how cunning he was, and how the system had these blind spots that let him stay a phantom. His escape as a youth had given him a head start, a period of being completely off the radar that turned out to be devastatingly effective. As the 1990s rolled on, the scientific world started to change. The brand new field of DNA technology was on the verge of completely changing criminal investigations, offering a small spark of hope in the grim reality of these unsolved murders. But for the time being, the killer was still out there, a ghost from Florida's past, whose shadow would stretch out for decades to come. Yeah, so the turn of the millennium, right? That brought a huge revolution. And it wasn't just about our computers or anything like that, no sir. It totally changed how we solved crimes, too. For ages, investigators were totally stumped by Florida's hidden killer. This guy was like a ghost, always striking from the shadows. But then, as the year 2000 rolled in, a brand new, super powerful ally started showing up, DNA technology. And man, it was evolving fast. Now this wasn't your grandpa's DNA analysis, the kind that needed big, perfect samples. Nope. Thanks to all the upgrades, even tiny, messed-up fragments, the ones that had been sitting in evidence bags for ages, they could now be looked at again with incredible accuracy. What used to be considered barely anything, like trace evidence, may be useless. It could now give us a whole genetic roadmap. Just think about all the stuff they collected from those early crime scenes. The hairs, the skin bits, the bodily fluids people left behind. For years and years, they were just silent. But now the tech finally caught up to what they could tell us. Forensic scientists, with their better methods and more sensitive gear, could really dig into these samples. They were unlocking secrets that had been hidden for like forever. This big tech jump, it was an absolute game changer for old, unsolved cases all over the country, but especially in Florida. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the FDLE, they'd been super careful about saving evidence from homicides that were never solved. They were really hoping that someday science would give them a break. Source: FDLE State FLUS. And that hidden killer case, which was this embarrassing stain on Florida's law enforcement history, it was totally ready for this new way of investigating. The moment it all clicked didn't happen with some big car chase or anything dramatic like that. Nah, it was more like the quiet hum of a lab machine. Scientists were able to pull out and amplify the degraded DNA profiles from the crime scenes. They were piecing together a genetic fingerprint. And get this, it wasn't just a partial match. They were actually creating a complete, unique DNA profile. So this super detailed profile, they put it into CODIS. That's the Combined DNA Index System. It's this national database, right? CODIS let law enforcement compare the new profiles they generated with ones they already had from convicted criminals and people who had been arrested. It was like a digital net, designed to connect crimes that seemed totally random and the people who did them. For the investigators still working on the hidden killer case, this was it. After all those years of pure frustration, they finally had something. The profile in CODIS was like a real lead, a ghost that finally got a face, even if it was a digital one. The hunt, which had felt like chasing smoke, was about to get serious. But here's the thing. The profile by itself wasn't the whole story. It gave them a genetic signature, sure, but not a name. The next step in the investigation involved this really advanced technique called forensic genetic genealogy. It's basically combining regular DNA analysis with old-school family tree research. They were building family trees using the DNA found at the crime scene. The investigators took the crime scene DNA profile and uploaded it to public genealogy websites. They were careful to follow privacy laws and only used anonymized data, of course. Then, they slowly, carefully started mapping out possible family connections. They were looking for people who shared a bunch of genetic markers with this unknown suspect. It was like trying to solve this gigantic, super complicated family puzzle that went back for generations. And man, this was a slow, tough process. Every single potential match they found had to be checked out super carefully. They weren't just looking for some distant cousin, you know. They were trying to figure out the exact branches of the family tree that would lead right to the killer. The list of possible suspects, which had been impossibly huge, started to get smaller, inch by agonizing inch. All that genealogy research, plus them digging back into the old case files and any old newspaper articles from when the murders happened, started to make things clearer. Source: newspapers.com. The investigators checked potential family lines against people who lived in the areas where the crimes happened, or guys who had a criminal record that matched how the killer did his thing. Then finally, the big break came. One specific genetic profile, pieced together painstakingly through all that family research, pointed to one single person. And the name that popped out of this complicated mess of DNA and family history, it was a shocker. It belonged to a guy who, from what everyone could tell, just lived a really quiet, boring life. The person they identified was Michael Scott, the guy who had terrified Florida for years, leaving behind all this fear and so many unanswered questions. He wasn't some shadowy character living on the outskirts of society. Nope. He was someone who just walked among everyone else, seemingly totally innocent. Court documents and his previous convictions, like when he escaped from a correctional facility, gave them crucial parts of his past that just hadn't fit together before. Source: courtlistener.com. And the shock wasn't just for the cops. It was for anyone who knew Michael Scott. The idea that a seemingly normal dude could have this kind of darkness inside him. It was a really chilling reminder of how evil can hide. Once they had a confirmed identity, law enforcement agencies got moving. The operation to catch Michael Scott was fast and super precise. They used their detailed knowledge of his routines and places he hung out. Tactical teams went in. It was tense, sure, but in the end, the hidden killer was finally brought out into the open. His capture meant the end of this decades-long spree of terror. It was a win for sheer persistence, for super thorough police work, and most importantly, for the undeniable power of better forensic science. That DNA, which had once been just a faint whisper on old evidence, had finally shouted its truth, bringing some much-needed closure to the victims and their families. For years and years, these awful crimes just hung heavy over Florida. But you know the story of this hidden killer. It also shines a light on a huge change in how we go after justice. When they got that super advanced DNA tech, it didn't just crack a cold case. It totally changed the whole forensic science game. What used to be this super tough, often impossible detective grind. Well, with genetic markers, it became this awesome tool for digging up stuff buried by time. This case, just like tons of others they're looking at again now, really shows how vital new ideas are for fixing what went wrong before. It's proof of the idea that even when leads dry up and people forget, the science stuff can hang around, just waiting for the tech to catch up. And for the families of the victims. Man, the impact is massive. After all those years of not knowing, of living with those unanswered questions and just endless grief, DNA finally gave them a real answer. It offered closure, a way to finally grieve and start moving on, knowing they caught the guy. Source: FDLE DNA Success Stories. But this whole ordeal, it's also a really harsh reminder of how the system used to fall short. The fact that the hidden killer could stay free for so long and even get away at one point really showed some big weak spots. Source: Florida Bar Journal Cold Case Homicides. This case teaches us something powerful. Don't ever give up on finding justice. It really hammers home how important it is to look at old evidence with fresh eyes and the latest tools. The screw-ups from the past, if you really dig into them, can actually light the way for success later on. Source: OJP Advancements in Forensic DNA Analysis. So the hidden killer's legacy? It's kind of a two-parter. It's a grim nod to the shortcomings that let evil stick around for way too long, but it's also a powerful shout-out to how tough people are and how science just keeps marching forward. Source: Archival News Articles, Orlando Sentinel. This investigation, going on for 30 years, it proves that no matter how long it takes, the truth eventually finds its way out. It's like a little light of hope, showing us that the puzzles from the past aren't necessarily gone for good. What other buried truths are just sitting there, waiting for science to shed some light on them? This case really makes you want to stay sharp, keep putting money into forensic progress, and believe that evidence in the end will always bring the bad guys to justice. Source: Court Records Court Listener.